The International Energy Agency recently released a report on the necessity of curtailing methane emissions from fossil fuel operations, particularly oil and gas. And I'm going to talk to Casey Michaels, who's a legal advisor in the Office of the Legal Counsel for the IEA, about that report. So he joins us from Paris. Welcome to the interview, Casey.
Thanks. Happy to be here.
Well, look, this is an interesting report. I mean, we've been seeing this for a number of years now that methane is a potent greenhouse gas. It's 80% more serious than CO2 in the first 20 years once it's released. So it has a lot of short-term impact. So there's a fair urgency to reduce methane emissions. Now, this report calls for the reduction of methane emissions by 75% by 2030. That's a pretty ambitious goal. Can you walk us through, just give us a brief overview of the report?
Sure, absolutely. Our focus with this report is on particularly oil and gas and coal. So this is really the methane emissions that are associated with fossil fuel operations. And in this area, the scope for cost-effective abatement is very high. There's already existing technologies. We know how to do this. So there's really possibility to get these emissions down very low, which is not quite as true in some of the other sectors for methane. And our focus with this report was starting from this goal of 75% to work backwards for what actions would get us there, particularly with a focus on those countries and companies that have already made a strong commitment, to try to see what are the things they can do to get us there and how far can they take us.
Yeah, I remember the first time I worked on this issue. I reported on a study that came out of the Barnett Shale in northern Texas in 2015, and 50% of the methane emissions that they measured came from broken valves and on gas processing plants, they have lids or anyway, there were things left open that resulted in leaks. I mean, these were all sort of standard repair and maintenance operations that maybe weren't as attended to as diligently as they should be. Is that the low-hanging fruit in this discussion?
There's really a few pieces of low-hanging fruit. That's one of the pieces of low-hanging fruit. And it's exactly as you say, that if we go out there with the right kind of camera, with the right tools, and just look at everything, every 3 months, we talk about quarterly leak detection and repair, we can notice a lot of these problems and fix them quickly. But there are two other potential areas. That one is a lot of the processes that are involved in some of these oil and gas operations are designed to leak. So you have a lot of components that use the pressure of the gas to operate valves, operate various pieces of equipment. And in the process of doing that, they let a little bit of the methane go. And we can be replacing those with different types of machinery that don't leak and that essentially use either electric power or they leak at a much slower rate. And the third piece is about flaring. There's still a lot of flaring that goes on in all across the world, but including in the US. And the assumption about flaring efficiency is that it is 98% efficient. And there's a lot of recent studies saying that that's an overestimate. So the farther we can get flaring down, the less corollary emissions there'll be of methane.
Right. The Permian Basin in Texas has been under scrutiny the last little while because of associated gas. So they're not producing gas by itself. It's gas that's produced when oil is produced. And their flaring is very common. And part of it is so much of it, and they didn't have the infrastructure to get it to market. And so they would flare it. And is that the case in other oil producing regions of the world?
It really depends. The specific market dynamics of the value of gas obviously are very local. So in some places where you're producing oil in a very remote location, it can be very, very difficult to actually get that gas somewhere where it could be useful. Thinking about the remote regions of Siberia or countries that there's not a dedicated gas infrastructure so that you can't sell the gas locally, you'd have to get it somewhere, put it in an LNG tanker, get it to a market. So it is a real challenge. There's also a series of regulatory challenges. Some places you might have a market accessible, but you need a permit to construct a pipeline to reach it, and that can introduce some delays. And so this issue, in many cases, it's flared, but at the very least, from our perspective, a properly functioning flare is much better than releasing it directly into the environment as a vent. So we really need to be working on these two things in parallel, because if you ban flaring, but you don't ban simply releasing it, then you end up with kind of a perverse incentive.
Right. And one of the other issues that's being resolved around methane emissions is measurement, because up until recently, with the implementation of some methane sniffing satellites, it actually wasn't, it was very difficult and kind of expensive to measure methane leaks in oil and gas production. But I gather then there's going to be a big push on to extend the scope of the satellite coverage for methane emission leaks.
Yeah, this is a really critical issue. On measurement, this is an issue from the very top to the very bottom. Satellites do have a lot of promise, particularly for kind of basin-wide and very high-level estimates. But at the same time, we also need to improve the way that we measure and determine how much leaks and how much emissions are at the ground. So we have satellites, but we also have aerial surveys, there are ground-based surveys, and there's new technologies that are kind of continuous monitoring systems based on towers and other things. And these things, in our view, are really critical, both to understand the nature of the emissions and understand where to reduce them, but also because it can enable better regulatory and policy approaches, things like taxes, performance standards, things that will really put the onus on the companies who are in the best position to know what's the cheapest way to resolve them. So in our view, there's really a bunch of things going on that a measurement needs to improve across the board, and that will enable a lot of different improvements to the way we handle this.
Now, it sounds like governments are going to have to intervene here with a fairly robust policy and regulatory framework. What is the IEA suggesting for that? And where are, I can imagine Europe, I know in Canada, it's getting, the regulations are becoming much more strict, the targets are higher. So where are the good guys in this who are bringing in those sorts of regulatory frameworks, and who are the not so good guys?
So yeah, there's a lot of discussion about this lately. I mean, as you know, there already are regulations at the federal level in the United States and in Canada, and also provincial level or state level in many states in those areas. And there are a few other countries that are doing a pretty good job, or have at least started down this pathway, including Mexico, and then some in the European Union and in Europe, like Norway is another good example. But in our view, even the ones that are doing a great job are just taking the first step. In the United States, for example, there are big swaths of the industry that aren't regulated, that aren't included either because the facilities are too small or because their existing infrastructure and most of the rules apply to new ones. So there's a lot more to be done there. And I just wanted to add that there is a kind of new emerging area when we think about a group like the European Union, where they're not only trying to think about regulations to address emissions within their borders, but also starting to think about what they can do to incentivize their trading partners upstream. Things like, as we heard a lot about, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which does not apply to methane and maybe never will. But this type of measure that's really aimed at making sure that whatever they put in place within the EU is also going to drive reductions outside. So there's really a lot of frontiers that are being considered now.
Now, if we're looking at a 75% reduction by 2030, that means that action has to begin like yesterday. And it sounds like there's still a tremendous amount of work to be done at the political level and then at the policy level. How optimistic are you that we're going to be able to get that done and hit those targets for 2030?
So one of the things that I'd like to point out is there's been a lot of action just in the past few weeks. The US and the EU announced this new global methane pledge, which is a 30% reduction, globally 30% reduction in methane by 2030. And taking that 75% reduction on oil, gas, and coal would be 25 of that 30. It would take us almost all the way to that pledge. And there are some countries joining that pledge that we haven't heard from before, or at least not on this topic. Iraq comes to mind, Argentina, and a few others like in Indonesia. So there is some action on this. And the way that from our calculations, what we estimate in the report is that if this group of committed countries does everything within their reach, they could potentially reach that 50% reduction from what we've already heard, from the commitments we've already seen. And that remaining bit will have to come from kind of broadening this coalition and bringing in some of these new actors, these other countries. And hopefully there's some scope for that, as we're seeing with new ones coming on board right now.
Great. Well, Casey, we hope that all of that takes place, because this is a critical issue in terms of the climate crisis. Thank you very much for this. Really appreciate your insights.
Thank you very much.